The familiar red glow of the Joe Rogan Experience podcast studio cast long shadows across the room as Jonathan Roumie adjusted his headphones. Across from him sat Joe Rogan, the podcast king himself, known for asking the questions that made guests squirm and viewers lean closer to their screens. What neither man expected was that a single question about faith would completely shatter Jonathan's composure and reveal the deepest struggle of his life. The moment that followed would become one of the most powerful exchanges in podcast history, leaving both men forever changed. "So, Jonathan," Joe began, settling back in his chair with his signature casual intensity, "for people who don't know, you played Jesus in The Chosen, which has become this massive phenomenon." Jonathan nodded, still getting used to the surreal nature of his newfound fame. "It's been incredible, Joe. When we started, we had no idea it would reach so many people around the world." Joe leaned forward slightly, his curiosity already piqued. "But here's what I'm fascinated by. You're not just playing a character, you're playing the character for millions of believers. That's got to mess with your head, right? Have you ever wondered what it's like to carry the weight of portraying the most important figure in human history? What happens when someone known for asking the hardest questions meets the man who has dedicated his life to embodying the answer?" This is the story of how Joe Rogan's relentless curiosity collided with Jonathan Roumie's deepest faith, creating a moment of raw honesty that would challenge everything both men thought they knew about belief, doubt, and the search for meaning. The interview had started typically enough, with Joe diving into Jonathan's background as an actor and musician. They discussed his journey from struggling performer to international recognition, the technical aspects of filming The Chosen, and the passionate fan base the show had attracted. Jonathan seemed relaxed, answering questions with the practiced ease of someone who had done countless interviews. But Joe Rogan wasn't interested in the typical promotional conversation that most hosts settled for. "You know what's wild to me?" Joe continued, taking a sip from his ever-present coffee mug, "is that you're from New York. You went to school for acting, and now you're this Jesus figure to millions of people." He studied Jonathan's face intently. "Did you grow up religious? Was this always part of your plan, or did you just stumble into playing the most famous person who ever lived?" Jonathan chuckled, but there was something thoughtful in his expression that suggested the question had touched on something deeper than casual conversation. "I grew up Catholic, but like a lot of people, I had a complicated relationship with organized religion for a while," Jonathan explained, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "I went through periods of doubt, especially in my 20s, when I was struggling as an actor and questioning everything about life and purpose." Joe nodded, recognizing the familiar journey of many people who had grown up in religious households. "The role of Jesus actually came at a time when I was rediscovering my faith, not running from it." Joe's eyebrows raised with interest. "So you're telling me that you got cast as Jesus right when you were getting back into Christianity? That's either the biggest coincidence in history or something else entirely." Jonathan smiled, but his eyes held a gravity that hadn't been there moments before. "I don't believe in coincidences anymore, Joe. Too many things had to align perfectly for this show to exist and for me to be part of it." The statement hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Joe was clearly eager to explore. "Okay, but let's dig into that," Joe pressed, leaning forward with the intensity that had made him famous for extracting truth from his guests. "You're saying you think there's some divine plan at work here, that God specifically wanted you to play Jesus?" Jonathan shifted slightly in his seat, recognizing that they were moving into territory that would require more vulnerability than he typically shared in interviews. "I think there are moments in life when you feel called to something bigger than yourself. This role has been one of those moments for me." Joe nodded slowly, processing Jonathan's words. "I've had guests on here who talk about feeling called to things. Comedians who knew they had to do comedy, fighters who felt destined for the octagon. But playing Jesus, that's a whole different level of responsibility." He paused, studying Jonathan's face. "How do you separate Jonathan the actor from Jesus the character? Or can you?" The question was deceptively simple, But Jonathan's reaction suggested it had hit something fundamental about his experience. "That's the thing, Joe," Jonathan said, his voice growing quieter. "The longer I've been in this role, the more I realize that separation isn't really possible. When you spend months at a time embodying someone's teachings, their compassion, their way of seeing people, it changes you." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that betrayed some inner tension. "I'm not the same person I was before I started playing Jesus. I can't be." Joe's eyes lit up with the recognition of a deeper story. "That's fascinating. So you're saying the role has actually changed your faith, not just your career?" Jonathan nodded slowly. "It's deepened it in ways I never expected, but it's also made it more complicated." The admission seemed to surprise even Jonathan himself, as if he hadn't fully articulated the struggle before. When millions of people see you as Jesus, when children watch the show and tell their parents they want to be like you, that's a weight that's hard to describe. "I bet," Joe agreed, his voice carrying genuine empathy. "I mean, I get stressed out when people expect me to be funny all the time, and that's nothing compared to what you're dealing with." He paused, then asked, "Do you ever feel like you're living up to impossible standards? Like you have to be perfect because of who you represent?" Jonathan's laugh was short and somewhat bitter. "Every single day. The pressure to be worthy of the role, to live up to what people expect. It's overwhelming sometimes." Joe sensed they were approaching something significant. "But here's what I'm curious about," he said, his tone becoming more thoughtful. "You've built your life around this faith. Your career is now defined by it. You've got millions of people looking to you as this spiritual figure." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "Have you ever had moments where you wondered if it's all real? If God actually exists?" The question dropped into the studio like a stone into still water, creating ripples that neither man could control. Jonathan's face went pale, and for several seconds he didn't speak. The confidence that had carried him through the first part of the interview seemed to evaporate, replaced by something raw and vulnerable. Joe didn't push, recognizing that he had touched something profound. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the quiet hum of recording equipment and the weight of a question that had clearly struck at the very core of Jonathan's existence. "That's..." Jonathan started, then stopped, his voice catching slightly. "That's the question, isn't the one that keeps me awake at night sometimes." He looked down at his hands, then back up at Joe with eyes that suddenly seemed much older and more troubled. "You want to know the truth? There are moments, especially late at night after long days of filming, when I wonder if I'm the world's biggest fraud." The admission was like a dam breaking, releasing something Jonathan had been holding back for months or even years. Joe remained perfectly still, recognizing that he was witnessing something extraordinary. "Tell me about those moments," he said gently, his usual confrontational style replaced by genuine curiosity and compassion. Jonathan took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what was about to come. "There are nights when I take off the costume, wash off the makeup, and look at myself in the mirror, wondering if I've dedicated my life to portraying someone who never existed." His voice was barely above a whisper. "What if it's all just stories? What if I'm giving people hope based on a beautiful lie?" The vulnerability in Jonathan's voice was palpable, and even Joe seemed affected by the raw honesty of the moment. "But you still do the work," Joe observed quietly. "You still show up, still pour yourself into the role. Why?" Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with thoughts he had clearly been carrying alone. "Because even in my darkest moments of doubt, I can't shake the feeling that there's something true in the message. The love, the compassion, the call to see the dignity in every person. Whether or not Jesus was who he claimed to be, those teachings have the power to change lives." Joe leaned back slightly, processing what he was hearing. "So you're saying that even if you're not sure about the divinity part, you believe in the moral teachings?" Jonathan nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "The problem is, Joe, that's not enough for a lot of people. Christians don't want to hear that the guy playing Jesus has doubts about whether Jesus was actually the Son of God." His laugh was hollow. "And non-believers think I'm delusional for dedicating my life to someone who might have been just a good teacher with good ideas." That's a hell of a position to be in, Joe acknowledged, his voice carrying genuine sympathy. You're caught between worlds, trying to honor something you're not always sure about, while representing it to people who are absolutely certain. Jonathan nodded gratefully, as if someone had finally understood the impossible tightrope he was walking. Exactly. And the weight of that responsibility, sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in it. Joe was quiet for a moment, then asked, when did these doubts start? Was it before the show, or did playing Jesus actually create them? Jonathan's expression grew even more pained. That's the terrible irony of it all. The deeper I've gone into the role, the more intimate I've become with the character, the more questions I've had. He paused, struggling with the words. It's like the closer you get to the sun, the more you realize how impossible it is to fully understand its nature. But you keep going toward it anyway, Joe observed. Jonathan nodded slowly. Because what's the alternative? Walk away from something that might be the most important truth in human history because I can't prove it beyond all doubt. His voice grew stronger as he continued. Even if there's only a chance that it's true, isn't that worth dedicating my life to? Isn't that worth the risk of being wrong? Joe's respect for Jonathan's honesty was evident in his expression. You know what's interesting about what you just said? You're approaching faith like a scientist or a philosopher. You're acknowledging uncertainty while still making a choice to act based on the possibility of truth. Jonathan looked surprised by this framing. I've never thought of it that way. He paused, considering Joe's words. I guess I've been so focused on the doubt that I haven't appreciated the courage it takes to choose faith in spite of uncertainty. That's exactly what it is, Joe agreed. I mean, I'm not a religious guy, but I can respect someone who says, I don't know for sure, but this matters enough to me that I'm going to live as if it's true. He leaned forward again. But let me ask you this, when you're on set, when you're in character as Jesus, do you feel anything, any sense of connection to something bigger? Jonathan's expression shifted, becoming more thoughtful and less pained. That's the thing that keeps me going, Jonathan said, his voice taking on a different quality. When I'm fully in character, when I'm speaking the words and trying to embody the love and compassion, there are moments when it feels like I'm touching something real. He struggled to find the right words. It's not like a voice from heaven or anything dramatic. It's more like stepping into a stream of love that was already flowing, and suddenly you're part of it. Joe's eyebrows raised with interest. That's a pretty powerful description. Do you think that feeling is you connecting with the divine? Or is it just the psychological effect of immersing yourself in positive teachings? Jonathan smiled for the first time since the difficult questions had begun. Honestly, I don't know the difference anymore. Maybe they're the same thing. Maybe the divine is found in the experience of love and compassion, regardless of whether there's a supernatural being orchestrating it all. If you're still watching this raw, honest moment unfold, if you've ever struggled with doubt while searching for meaning, go ahead and hit that like button and comment "searching" below. Let's see how many of us understand that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about having the courage to keep asking the questions that matter most, even when they shake us to our core. Joe nodded approvingly. Now, that's a perspective I can relate to. You're not claiming to have certainty about supernatural claims, but you're recognizing something valuable in the experience itself. He paused, then asked, how do your fans react when they sense this uncertainty in you? Do they pick up on it? Jonathan's expression grew complicated again. Some do. I get messages from people who say they can see the struggle in my eyes, even when I'm in character. He shook his head. It terrifies me sometimes, thinking that my doubts might undermine someone else's faith. But maybe it does the opposite, Joe suggested. Maybe seeing someone wrestle with these questions honestly makes it more real for them, not less. Jonathan looked up with surprise. What do you mean? Joe leaned back, organizing his thoughts. I mean, if you were just some guy who claimed to have perfect faith and never questioned anything, that might be less relatable than someone who's clearly grappling with the big questions while still choosing to live by the teachings. I never thought of it that way, Jonathan admitted. I've been so afraid that my doubts were a weakness, something that disqualified me from the role. He paused, considering Joe's words. But maybe the struggle is part of what makes it authentic. Maybe faith without questions isn't really faith at all. It's just blind acceptance. The realization seemed to be shifting something in Jonathan's understanding of his own experience. Joe nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. I mean, look at the character you're playing. Jesus had moments of doubt too, right? My God, why have you forsaken me? That's not the cry of someone with perfect certainty. Jonathan's eyes widened as if he was seeing something for the first time. You're right. Even Jesus wrestled with the darkness, with the feeling of abandonment. Maybe the doubt isn't the opposite of faith. Maybe it's part of it. Now you're talking, Joe said with genuine enthusiasm. You're finding a way to be honest about your struggles while still honoring what you believe. That's way more powerful than pretending to have it all figured out. Jonathan seemed to be experiencing a real-time shift in his understanding. All this time, I've been carrying the weight of thinking I had to be perfect, had to have unshakable faith to be worthy of the role. His voice grew stronger. But maybe the role chose me precisely because I understand the struggle, because I can bring that humanity to the character. Joe smiled, recognizing the breakthrough that was happening. How does it feel to say that out loud? To admit that you don't have all the answers but you're still committed to the journey? Jonathan was quiet for a moment, then a genuine smile spread across his face. It feels like I can breathe again, like I've been holding my breath for months, afraid that someone would discover I wasn't the perfect Christian they expected me to be. He laughed, and this time it sounded lighter. The relief is incredible. That's beautiful, Joe said sincerely. And you know what? I bet your portrayal of Jesus is going to be even more powerful now that you've given yourself permission to be human while doing it. Jonathan nodded, looking more relaxed than he had since the interview began. I think you're right. The character becomes more real when the actor brings his whole self to it, including the parts that are still figuring things out. He paused. Maybe that's what faith actually is. Not having all the answers, but being willing to keep asking the questions and living by what seems true. Joe leaned forward with renewed curiosity. Let me ask you something else. When you're going through those dark nights of the soul, questioning everything, what brings you back? What makes you choose to keep going with the role and the faith journey? Jonathan's expression became thoughtful again, but this time without the earlier pain. It's usually something simple. A message from a fan whose life was changed by the show, or a moment on set when the words I'm speaking as Jesus hit me in a new way. He smiled. Or sometimes it's just watching how the other actors respond to the material. The show creates this environment where everyone is thinking about love, forgiveness, and what it means to be human. That's interesting, Joe mused. So it's not necessarily supernatural experiences that reinforce your faith, it's seeing the human impact of these teachings. Jonathan nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. Whether or not Jesus was divine, the teachings attributed to him have the power to transform lives. I see it every day in the cast, the crew, the fans. He paused. Maybe that's evidence enough. Maybe the fruit of the teaching is more important than being able to prove the historical claims. Joe's expression showed his appreciation for this perspective. You know, that's a really mature way to approach it. You're saying that the value of faith can be measured by its impact on human flourishing, not just by its historical accuracy. Jonathan looked relieved to hear his thoughts reflected back to him so clearly. Yes, that's it exactly, and when I look at it that way, the doubts don't feel as threatening. He leaned forward. Even if I can't prove that Jesus strutting, performed miracles or rose from the dead, I can see the miracles happening in people's lives when they embrace the message of love and forgiveness. That's profound, Joe acknowledged. And it explains why you can continue doing the work even while wrestling with uncertainty. He paused, then asked, Do you think the struggle has made you a better actor? More connected to the human side of the character? Jonathan considered the question carefully. Absolutely. The Jesus I portray now has more depth than he would have if I'd approached the role with simple, unquestioned faith. He smiled. The certainty would have made him less relatable, less human. The struggle I bring to the role makes him more accessible to people who are on their own faith journeys. Joe nodded approvingly. It's like method acting on a spiritual level. You're not just playing the character, you're living the questions the character would have lived. Jonathan's eyes lit up with understanding. That's a brilliant way to put it. Method acting for the soul. He laughed. I never thought of spiritual struggle as a tool for better performance. But maybe that's exactly what it is. Maybe God, if he exists, uses our doubts to make us more authentic messengers. Now that, Joe said with genuine admiration, is a perspective that works whether you're a believer or not. You're finding meaning in the struggle itself, not just in the answers. He paused. How do you think your fans would react if they heard what you just shared? Would they be disappointed, or would they find it liberating? Jonathan's expression became thoughtful. I hope they'd find it liberating. I hope they'd realize that faith isn't about having perfect certainty, it's about wrestling with the big questions while still choosing to live by love. You know what's interesting about this whole conversation? Joe observed. You started by talking about your doubts as if they were a failure of faith, but now you're talking about them as potentially essential to authentic faith. Jonathan nodded, clearly experiencing a shift in his own understanding. It's like the difference between faith as a destination and faith as a journey. I've been beating myself up for not having arrived when maybe the whole point is to keep walking. He paused. Maybe doubt isn't the enemy of faith. Maybe it's the thing that keeps faith honest and alive. Joe smiled broadly. That's beautiful, man. You've basically just redefined faith in a way that's intellectually honest and spiritually meaningful. He leaned back in his chair. How does it feel to have worked through that in real time? Do you feel different than when we started this conversation? Jonathan laughed, and the sound was full of genuine joy. I feel like I've been carrying this heavy secret, and suddenly I realize it wasn't a secret I needed to keep. He shook his head in amazement. I feel lighter, more authentic, more ready to step back into the role with integrity. That's incredible, Joe said sincerely. And I think what you've shared is going to resonate with a lot of people who struggle with similar questions. He paused. Let me ask you this. Do you think you'll approach the role differently now? Will this conversation change how you play Jesus? Jonathan nodded immediately. Absolutely. I think I'll bring more humanity to it, more of the struggle that every person faces when trying to live up to ideals of love and compassion. He smiled. I think I'll be less afraid to show the human side of divinity. Joe's appreciation for Jonathan's journey was evident. You know, this might be one of the most honest discussions about faith I've ever had on the podcast, not because you have all the answers, but because you're willing to admit you don't. Jonathan looked genuinely moved by this assessment. Thank you for creating the space for me to work through this, Joe. I didn't know I needed to have this conversation until we were having it. He paused. I feel like I understand my own faith better now than I did when we started. That's the power of honest dialogue, Joe replied. Sometimes we don't know what we think until we have to articulate it to someone else. He leaned forward with renewed curiosity. Let me ask you something else. Now that you've reframed doubt as potentially essential to authentic faith, how do you think that changes your responsibility to your audience? Jonathan considered this carefully. I think it makes me more responsible to be honest about the journey, not just the destination, to show people that it's okay to wrestle with these questions while still choosing to live by love and compassion. That's a huge shift, Joe observed. You're moving from feeling like you have to be the perfect Christian to being willing to be the honest Christian. Jonathan nodded emphatically. And I think that's actually more helpful to people. Perfect faith is intimidating and unrelatable. Honest faith is something people can connect with and find hope in. He smiled. Maybe the best thing I can offer people isn't certainty about all the answers, but courage to keep asking the questions that matter. Joe's expression showed deep respect for Jonathan's evolution. You've basically just rewritten your entire relationship with faith and your role in the middle of our conversation. That's pretty remarkable. Jonathan laughed, shaking his head in amazement. I know, right? I came in here thinking I was hiding something shameful, and I'm leaving feeling like I've discovered something beautiful." He paused. The idea that doubt can be sacred, that questions can be forms of prayer, that changes everything. It really does. Joe agreed, and I think it makes your portrayal of Jesus more powerful, not less. You're bringing the full human experience to a character that a lot of people sanitize or make too perfect to relate to. Jonathan's eyes lit up with understanding. Exactly. The Jesus I can portray now is someone who understands what it feels like to question, to struggle, to wonder if he's on the right path. He smiled. That's a Jesus who can meet people where they actually are, not where they think they should be. Joe nodded approvingly. And that's probably closer to the historical Jesus anyway, a guy who was fully human, wrestling with his calling, facing real temptations and real doubts. Jonathan looked thoughtful. You know, that perspective makes the story more powerful, not less. A perfect being choosing to love is one thing, but a struggling human being choosing to love despite doubt and fear, that's inspiring. He paused. That's a choice every person can make regardless of their certainty about theological questions. Now you're talking about universal truths, Joe said with enthusiasm. You've moved from talking about specifically Christian faith to talking about the human experience of choosing love over fear. Jonathan's expression showed his appreciation for this insight. And maybe that's what the message was always about. Not about having the right beliefs, but about making the choice to love, forgive, and see the dignity in every person. He smiled. That's something an atheist and a believer can both get behind. Joe leaned back with satisfaction. That's beautiful, man. You found a way to honor your faith while making it accessible to people who don't share your beliefs. He paused. How do you think this realization will affect your work going forward? Not just The Chosen, but your approach to faith in general. Jonathan was quiet for a moment, clearly processing the implications. I think it makes me more interested in the questions than the answers. More focused on the practice of love than the theory of belief. He smiled. More human, less perfect. More honest, less performative. That sounds like a healthier way to live, Joe observed. And probably a more effective way to influence people too. Jonathan nodded enthusiastically. I think you're right. People can smell inauthenticity from a mile away. But when you're genuinely wrestling with something, when you're being honest about your struggles while still choosing to move toward love, that's compelling. He paused. That's what I want to bring to the role now. Not perfect faith, but honest faith. Joe's admiration for Jonathan's journey was clear. You know what's funny? I asked you that question about God's existence thinking it might trip you up or create some controversy, he laughed. Instead, it seems to have freed you to be more authentic about your faith, not less. Jonathan joined in the laughter. That's the thing about honest questions. They don't destroy faith, they refine it. They burn away the parts that aren't real and leave behind what actually matters. That's a great way to put it, Joe agreed. Faith as refinement through questioning, rather than faith as unexamined belief. He leaned forward with genuine curiosity. So now that you've had this breakthrough, what are you most excited about as you continue with The Chosen? How will this change your approach? Jonathan's enthusiasm was evident. I'm excited to bring more of this humanity to Jesus, to show someone who understands struggle because he's lived it, who can offer hope because he's wrestled with despair. He smiled. I think it will make the character more relatable and the message more powerful. Joe nodded approvingly. And it probably takes some of the pressure off too, right? You don't have to be perfect anymore, you just have to be honest. Jonathan's relief was visible. Exactly. The weight of trying to be worthy of the role was crushing. But the freedom to bring my whole self to it, including the parts that are still figuring things out, that's energizing. He paused. I feel like I can actually breathe while doing the work now. That's incredible, Joe said sincerely. You've basically just had a therapy session disguised as a podcast interview. Both men laughed at this observation. But seriously, Joe continued, I think what you've shared is going to help a lot of people who struggle with similar questions about faith and doubt. Jonathan nodded gratefully. I hope so. I hope people realize that it's okay to wrestle with these big questions while still choosing to live by love and compassion. Joe's expression grew more thoughtful. You know, there's something else interesting about what you've shared. You've basically described faith as a practice rather than a belief system. Jonathan looked intrigued by this framing. What do you mean? Joe explained. I mean, you're talking about faith as something you do, choosing love, practicing forgiveness, serving others, rather than something you simply believe in your head. Jonathan's eyes widened with recognition. That's exactly right. Faith is a way of being in the world, not just a set of propositions you accept. And that makes it more accessible to everyone. Joe continued. You don't have to believe in miracles to practice love. You don't have to understand the Trinity to forgive someone who's hurt you. Jonathan nodded enthusiastically. Yes, and maybe that's what the teachings were always pointing toward. Not abstract theological concepts, but practical ways of living that create more love and less suffering in the world. He paused. That's something anyone can participate in, regardless of their religious background. Joe smiled broadly. Now you're talking about faith in a way that even a skeptic like me can appreciate. You're focusing on the practical impact rather than the unprovable claims. Jonathan looked relieved and energized by this perspective. And the beautiful thing is, when you focus on the practice, the questions about the claims become less important. He smiled. Maybe the point was never to have perfect theological understanding, but to live in a way that reflects love and compassion. That's profound, Joe acknowledged. You've basically just redefined success in faith terms. Instead of measuring faith by certainty, you're measuring it by its fruits in your life and the lives of others. Jonathan's excitement was evident. Exactly, and when I look at it that way, I can see evidence of faith working everywhere. In the cast and crew who've been changed by the show, in the fans whose lives have been transformed, in my own growth as a person. He paused. That's evidence I can actually point to. Joe leaned back with satisfaction. You know what's really beautiful about this conversation? You found a way to deepen your faith by questioning it, not despite questioning it. Jonathan nodded emphatically. The questions didn't destroy my faith. They made it more real, more honest, more grounded in actual experience rather than abstract beliefs. He smiled. I feel more connected to my faith now than I did when I was trying to have perfect certainty about everything. And that probably makes you a better messenger for it too, Joe observed. People trust someone who's wrestled with doubts more than someone who claims to have never questioned anything. Jonathan's expression showed his appreciation for this insight. I think you're right. The struggle makes the message more credible, not less. He paused, and it makes me more compassionate toward others who are on their own journeys of questioning and discovery. Joe's respect for Jonathan's honesty was evident. You know, this might be the most authentic discussion of faith I've ever been part of. Not because you have all the answers, but because you're willing to live the questions. Jonathan looked genuinely moved by this assessment. Thank you, Joe. This conversation has been a gift. I didn't realize how much I needed to work through these thoughts until I had the space to do it. He smiled. I feel like I understand myself and my faith better than I have in years. That's the power of honest dialogue, Joe replied. Sometimes we don't know what we really think until we have to articulate it to someone else, especially someone who's willing to ask the hard questions. He paused. And you've shown that faith can handle those hard questions. It doesn't have to hide from them. Jonathan nodded gratefully. That's exactly right. The questions aren't the enemy of faith. They're what keep faith alive and growing. Joe leaned forward with renewed curiosity. Let me ask you one more thing. Now that you've reframed your relationship with doubt and faith, what advice would you give to other people who are struggling with similar questions? Jonathan considered this carefully. I'd tell them that the struggle is sacred, that questions can be forms of prayer, and that you don't have to have everything figured out to choose love. He smiled. I'd tell them that doubt doesn't disqualify you from faith. It makes you a more honest participant in it. That's beautiful advice, Joe said sincerely, and it's advice that could help people whether they're believers or skeptics. Jonathan nodded enthusiastically, because at the end of the day, We're all trying to figure out how to live meaningful lives, how to love well, how to face suffering and death with dignity. He paused. Those are human questions, not just religious ones, and the teachings attributed to Jesus offer wisdom for those questions regardless of your beliefs about his divinity. Joe's appreciation for this perspective was clear. You've managed to honor your specific faith tradition while making it accessible to people from all backgrounds. That's no small feat. Jonathan looked both humbled and energized by this observation. I think that's what happens when you stop trying to defend faith and start trying to live it honestly. He smiled. The defense becomes unnecessary when the practice speaks for itself. And that probably makes your portrayal of Jesus more powerful too, Joe suggested. You're not playing a perfect religious figure, you're playing a human being who chose to embody love despite doubt and struggle. Jonathan's eyes lit up with understanding. Yes, that's a Jesus people can relate to, can aspire to be like, not because he was perfect, but because he chose love in the face of uncertainty. He paused. That's a choice every person can make. Joe nodded approvingly, and that brings the whole message into the realm of practical reality rather than abstract theology. He leaned back with satisfaction. You know, I think you've just given people permission to have honest faith rather than perfect faith. Jonathan looked genuinely moved by this summary. If that's what people take from this conversation, then it was worth every moment of vulnerability. He smiled. Honest faith is so much more sustainable than perfect faith. It's also more attractive, Joe observed. Perfect faith is intimidating. Honest faith is inspiring. He paused. How do you think your castmates and the show's creators will react to what you've shared today? Jonathan's expression showed some nervousness returning. I hope they'll understand that this makes me more committed to the project, not less. That working through these questions deepens my connection to the character, rather than undermining it. He paused. I think they will. The show has always been about honest storytelling. Joe smiled reassuringly. I think they'll see what I see, that you've just become a more authentic messenger for the message they're trying to share. He leaned forward. And honestly, what you've shared today probably helps the show reach a broader audience. People who might have dismissed it as religious propaganda might be more open to it, knowing that the lead actor wrestles with the same questions they do. Jonathan's expression brightened with this possibility. That would be incredible, Jonathan said with genuine enthusiasm. If the show can create bridges between believers and skeptics, if it can create space for honest questioning rather than just confirming existing beliefs, that would be a beautiful outcome. He paused. Maybe that's part of why I was cast in this role. Not because I had perfect faith, but because I could bring authentic human struggle to it. Joe nodded emphatically. I think you're exactly right. Perfect faith would have made the character less relatable, less human. He leaned forward with renewed interest. The struggle you bring to the role probably makes Jesus more accessible to people who are on their own spiritual journeys. Jonathan's relief was visible as he processed this perspective. I've been so afraid that my doubts made me unworthy of the role, but maybe they're exactly what the role needed. He smiled genuinely for the first time in the conversation. Maybe God, if he exists, uses broken people, not despite their brokenness, but because of it. That's a powerful realization, Joe acknowledged, his voice carrying genuine respect. And it explains why your portrayal resonates with so many people. They're seeing someone who understands their struggles, not someone who's above them. Jonathan nodded, his entire demeanor shifting as the weight of shame seemed to lift from his shoulders. All this time I've been trying to be worthy of playing Jesus, when maybe the whole point is that none of us are worthy. And that's exactly why we need the message of grace and love. The theological insight seemed to surprise even Jonathan himself. Joe's expression showed his appreciation for the depth of Jonathan's reflection. You know what's interesting? You've just described the core of what most Christians would call the gospel. That God loves imperfect people, not because they're perfect, but precisely because they're not. Jonathan's eyes widened with recognition. You're right. I've been living the opposite of what I claim to believe. I've been thinking I had to earn the right to represent Jesus instead of accepting that grace is for people exactly like me. People with doubts and questions and struggles. And that makes your message more powerful, not less, Joe emphasized. People don't need to see perfect faith. They need to see authentic faith. They need to see someone wrestling with the same questions they're wrestling with, while still choosing to live by love. Jonathan was nodding enthusiastically now, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. The doubt doesn't disqualify me from the role, it qualifies me for it in a different way. It makes me someone who can understand why people struggle with faith. Joe leaned back, clearly moved by the transformation he was witnessing. This has been incredible to watch, man. You came in here carrying the secret shame about your doubts, and you're leaving with a completely different understanding of how those doubts actually serve the message you're trying to share. Jonathan laughed, and this time was full of genuine joy and relief. I feel like I've been holding my breath for months, and I can finally exhale. The relief is almost overwhelming. How do you think this is going to change your approach to the work? Joe asked with genuine curiosity. Will you bring this new understanding to the set? Jonathan's excitement was immediately evident. Absolutely. I think I can bring more humanity to Jesus now, more of the struggle that every person faces when trying to live up to ideals of love and compassion. He paused, his expression growing thoughtful. I think I'll be less afraid to show the moments of uncertainty, the human side of divinity. That's probably more accurate to who Jesus actually was anyway. Joe nodded approvingly. And it makes the character more inspiring too. It's one thing for a perfect being to choose love. It's another thing entirely for someone who struggles with doubt and fear to make that choice anyway. Jonathan's face lit up with understanding. Exactly. That's a choice every person can make, regardless of their certainty about theological questions. You don't have to have perfect faith to choose love over hate, forgiveness over revenge, hope over despair. The universal nature of this message seemed to energize him. Now you're talking about something that transcends religious boundaries, Joe observed with enthusiasm. You're talking about fundamental human choices that matter whether someone is Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, or atheist. Jonathan nodded emphatically. And maybe that's what the teachings were always pointing toward. Not abstract theological concepts, but practical ways of living that create more love and less suffering in the world. He smiled. That's something anyone can participate in, regardless of their religious background. Joe's respect for Jonathan's journey was evident in his voice. You know what's remarkable about this conversation? You've managed to deepen your faith by questioning it, while simultaneously making it more accessible to people who don't share your beliefs. Jonathan looked genuinely amazed by this summary. I never thought of it that way, but you're right. The questions didn't weaken my faith. They refined it, stripped away the parts that weren't essential, and left behind what really matters. He paused. Which is love. It always comes back to love. And that's something everyone can understand, Joe agreed. You don't need a theology degree to recognize the value of choosing love over fear. He leaned forward with renewed curiosity. Let me ask you this. Do you think your fans will be surprised by what you've shared today? Will they see this as a crisis of faith, or as an evolution of faith? Jonathan considered this question carefully, his expression showing both hope and nervousness. I hope they'll see it as evolution, Jonathan said honestly. I hope they'll understand that questioning isn't the opposite of faith. It's what keeps faith alive and growing. He paused, then added with vulnerability. But I know some people prefer their religious figures to have perfect certainty. Some might be disappointed to learn that the guy playing Jesus wrestles with doubt. His concern for his audience was genuine and touching. Joe's voice carried reassurance as he responded. But here's the thing. The people who are disappointed by honesty probably weren't really connecting with the authentic message anyway. The people who are drawn to truth, who are on their own spiritual journeys, they're going to find what you've shared deeply encouraging. Jonathan's expression brightened as he considered this perspective. You're right. Maybe this conversation will attract the people who need to hear that it's okay to question while still choosing to live by love. Exactly, Joe agreed. and it might help the show reach people who previously dismissed it as being only for people with unquestioning faith. He smiled. You've basically just made the message more inclusive, not less. Jonathan looked genuinely excited by this possibility. If the show can create bridges between believers and skeptics, if it can create space for honest questioning rather than just confirming existing beliefs, that would be incredible. The potential impact seemed to energize him. Joe leaned back with satisfaction. You know, this might be one of the most important conversations you've ever had about your work. Not because you've abandoned your faith, but because you've found a more authentic way to live it. Jonathan nodded gratefully. I feel like I understand my calling better now than I ever have. It's not to represent perfect faith. It's to represent honest faith. To show people that you can wrestle with questions while still choosing to live by love and compassion. That's a beautiful mission, Joe acknowledged, and it's one that serves everyone, regardless of where they are on their spiritual journey. He paused, then asked, how do you think this conversation will affect your personal life? Will you approach your own faith differently now? Jonathan's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the question. I think I'll be more patient with myself, more accepting of the questions and doubts as part of the journey rather than obstacles to overcome. He smiled. I think I'll pray differently too. Less trying to convince God I'm worthy, more honest conversation about where I actually am. Joe's appreciation for this insight was clear. That sounds like a healthier relationship with faith, more honest, less performative. Jonathan nodded enthusiastically. Yes. And I think it will make me more compassionate toward others who are struggling with similar questions. I won't feel like I have to have all the answers to be helpful to someone else's journey. He paused. Maybe the most helpful thing I can offer people is my willingness to wrestle with the questions alongside them. That's profound, Joe said sincerely. You're talking about faith as companionship in the struggle rather than as having arrived at the destination. Jonathan's eyes lit up with understanding. Exactly. Faith as walking together through the questions, not as having all the answers. He smiled. That's so much more sustainable than trying to maintain perfect certainty about everything. The relief in his voice was palpable. Joe leaned forward with genuine curiosity. Let me ask you something else. Now that you've reframed your relationship with doubt, how do you think that will affect your preparation for future seasons of the show? Jonathan's excitement was immediately evident. I think I'll approach the character with more curiosity and less pressure. Instead of trying to become Jesus, I'll focus on understanding what it means to choose love in difficult circumstances. He paused. I'll bring my questions to the role, instead of trying to hide them. That's going to make for some powerful performances, Joe observed. When an actor brings their authentic self to a role, including their struggles and questions, that's when the magic happens. Jonathan nodded emphatically. I think you're right. The performances will be more honest, because I'll be more honest. The character will have more depth because I'm bringing more of my real self to it. He smiled. I'm actually excited to get back to set now, whereas before I was dreading it because of the pressure to be perfect. Joe's satisfaction with the conversation was evident. You know what's beautiful about this whole discussion? You've turned your greatest fear, that people would discover you have doubts, into your greatest strength as an actor and as a messenger for this message. Jonathan looked genuinely amazed by this reframing. I never thought of it that way, but you're absolutely right. The thing I was most ashamed of might actually be what makes me most effective in the role. He laughed, shaking his head in wonder. That's either ironic or providential, depending on your perspective. Maybe it's both, Joe suggested with a grin. Maybe Providence works through irony. Both men laughed at this observation. But seriously, Joe continued, I think what you've discovered today is going to transform not just your work, but your whole approach to life and faith. Jonathan nodded gratefully. I feel like I've been given permission to be human while doing this sacred work. That's a gift I didn't even know I needed. The gratitude in his voice was deeply moving. Joe's expression grew more thoughtful. You know, there's something else interesting about what you've shared. You've basically described a form of faith that's compatible with intellectual honesty. Jonathan looked intrigued by this observation. What do you mean? Joe explained. I mean, you're not asking anyone to believe things that can't be questioned or examined. You're saying that faith can coexist with doubt, that love can be chosen even in the absence of certainty. Jonathan's eyes widened with recognition. That's exactly right, Jonathan agreed enthusiastically. I'm not asking anyone to check their brain at the door. I'm saying that even intelligent, thinking people can choose to live by love and compassion, while still wrestling with the big questions. He paused. Maybe that's what mature faith looks like, not the absence of questions, but the willingness to live by love despite having questions. The theological sophistication of this insight was remarkable. Joe nodded approvingly. And that makes faith accessible to people who might otherwise dismiss it as anti-intellectual or requiring blind belief. Jonathan's excitement was evident. Yes, it creates space for scientists, philosophers, skeptics, anyone who values intellectual honesty, to engage with the teachings without having to abandon their commitment to truth and evidence. He smiled. That could open up the message to so many people who currently feel excluded from religious conversations. That's incredible, Joe said with genuine admiration. You found a way to honor both faith and reason, both belief and doubt. He leaned back, clearly impressed by the journey he had witnessed. How does it feel to have worked through all of this in real time? Do you feel different than when we started? Jonathan's expression showed amazement at his own transformation. I feel like I've been reborn in some way. Not in a cheesy religious sense, but in the sense that I see myself and my calling completely differently now. That's beautiful, Joe acknowledged. And the best part is, it happened through honest questioning, not despite it. Jonathan nodded emphatically. The questions didn't destroy my faith. They liberated it from the prison of perfectionism. He laughed. I was so afraid that admitting doubt would disqualify me from representing Jesus. But instead it's made me more qualified because I understand the human struggle more deeply. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Joe's respect for Jonathan's journey was evident. You know what you've done today? You've given people permission to have honest faith rather than perfect faith. That's going to help a lot of people who are struggling with similar questions. Jonathan looked genuinely moved by this possibility. If this conversation helps even one person realize that they don't have to choose between intellectual honesty and spiritual meaning, then it was worth every moment of vulnerability. The sincerity was touching. I think it's going to help a lot more than one person, Joe assured him. What you've shared today is going to resonate with anyone who's ever wrestled with doubt while still longing for meaning and purpose. He paused, then added, and I think it's going to make your portrayal of Jesus more powerful than it's ever been. Jonathan's gratitude was evident in his expression. Thank you, Joe. This conversation has been a gift. I didn't realize how much I needed to work through these thoughts until I had the space to do it. Joe smiled warmly. That's what happens when you create space for honest dialogue. Sometimes we don't know what we really think until we have to articulate it to someone else. He leaned forward with genuine curiosity. So what happens next? How do you take this new understanding back to your life and work? Jonathan's excitement was immediately evident. I go back to the set with a completely different relationship to the role. Instead of trying to be worthy of playing Jesus, I'll focus on bringing authentic humanity to the character. And that will probably make the character more relatable and inspiring. Joe observed. People don't need to see perfect faith. They need to see honest faith. Jonathan nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. They need to see someone who understands their struggles because he's lived them, who can offer hope because he's wrestled with despair. He paused. I think the character will be more compelling now because he'll be more human. The transformation in Jonathan's understanding was complete and beautiful to witness. Joe's satisfaction with the conversation was evident. You know, this has been one of the most honest discussions about faith I've ever been part of. Not because you have all the answers, but because you're willing to live the questions. Jonathan looked genuinely moved by this assessment. Thank you for creating the space for me to be vulnerable, to work through these thoughts out loud. He smiled. I feel like I understand myself and my faith better than I have in years. That's the power of honest conversation, Joe replied. And I think what you've shared is going to inspire a lot of people to approach their own faith journeys with more honesty and less pressure to be perfect. He paused, then asked, "Any final thoughts you want to share with people who might be watching this and wrestling with similar questions?" Jonathan considered this carefully, wanting to offer something meaningful to others who might be struggling. "I'd tell them that the struggle is sacred," Jonathan said thoughtfully. "That questions can be forms of prayer, and that you don't have to have everything figured out to choose love." His voice carried the conviction of someone who had just discovered a profound truth. "I'd tell them that doubt doesn't disqualify you from faith, it makes you a more honest participant in it." He smiled. "And I'd tell them that the journey is more important than the destination, that wrestling with these questions is part of what makes us human." Joe nodded approvingly. "That's beautiful advice, and it's advice that could help people whether they're believers or skeptics." Jonathan's expression showed his appreciation for this observation. Because at the end of the day, we're all trying to figure out how to live meaningful lives, how to love well, how to face suffering and uncertainty with grace. He paused. "Those are human questions, not just religious ones. And I think the teachings attributed to Jesus offer wisdom for those questions regardless of your beliefs about his divinity." "That's a perfect place to end," Joe said with genuine satisfaction. "You've managed to honor your specific faith tradition while making it accessible to people from all backgrounds." Jonathan looked both humbled and energized by this summary. If people take away from this conversation that it's okay to question while still choosing to live by love, then I'm grateful for the opportunity to share it. He smiled. Honest faith is so much more sustainable and authentic than perfect faith. Joe leaned back with clear admiration for the journey he had witnessed. "Jonathan, this has been incredible. You came in here carrying what you thought was a shameful secret, and you're leaving with a completely transformed understanding of how that struggle actually serves your calling." Jonathan's gratitude was evident in every word as he responded. "This conversation has been a gift, Joe. I didn't know how much I needed to work through these thoughts until I had the space to do it with someone willing to ask the hard questions." "That's what we're here for," Joe replied warmly, "to create space for real conversations about the things that matter most." He paused, then added, "And I think what you've shared today is going to help a lot of people who are on similar journeys." Jonathan's hope for the impact of their conversation was evident. If it helps people realize that faith and doubt can coexist, that love can be chosen even in uncertainty, then every moment of vulnerability was worth it. Joe's final assessment carried deep respect. "You know what you've done today? You've shown that authentic faith is more powerful than perfect faith, that honest struggle is more inspiring than claims of certainty." Jonathan nodded, clearly moved by this summary. "And I've learned that the questions I was most afraid of are actually what make the message more accessible and real." He smiled. "The doubt doesn't disqualify me from representing Jesus, it qualifies me to represent him to people who understand struggle." "Exactly," Joe agreed. "And that's probably exactly what the role needed. Someone who could bring authentic humanity to it, rather than religious perfection." Jonathan's transformation was complete. His earlier anxiety replaced by peaceful confidence. "I feel like I can go back to the work now with integrity, knowing that I don't have to pretend to be something I'm not." He paused. "I can bring my whole self to the role, including the parts that are still figuring things out." Joe's satisfaction with their conversation was evident as he prepared to wrap up. "This has been one of the most meaningful discussions we've had on the podcast, not because we solved any great mysteries, but because we created space for honest wrestling with the questions that matter most." Jonathan's gratitude was profound and genuine. "Thank you for giving me the courage to be vulnerable, to admit that I don't have all the answers while still being committed to the journey of faith." His voice carried the peace of someone who had found authenticity. "That's what makes for the best conversations," Joe observed. "When people are willing to be real about their struggles and questions, rather than pretending to have it all figured out. He looked directly at Jonathan with genuine respect. What you've shared today is going to resonate with so many people who feel caught between faith and doubt, who think they have to choose one or the other. Jonathan's hope for the impact was evident in his response. If people realize they can hold both faith and questions, both love and uncertainty, then this conversation will have served its purpose, Jonathan said with conviction. The Christian tradition is rich with people who wrestled with God, who asked hard questions, while still choosing to follow the path of love. He smiled. I'm just joining a long line of people who've discovered that doubt can deepen faith rather than destroy it. The theological maturity of his insight was remarkable. Joe nodded with appreciation. And you've shown that faith can be intellectually honest, that you don't have to abandon reason to embrace spiritual meaning. Jonathan's excitement about this realization was evident. Yes, that opens up the conversation to so many people who felt excluded from religious discussions because they valued intellectual integrity. He paused. Maybe that's part of why I was cast in this role, to build bridges between faith and reason, between believers and seekers. I think you're exactly right, Joe agreed. And after today's conversation, I think you're going to be even more effective at building those bridges. Jonathan's gratitude for the journey he had just completed was evident in every word. I feel like I've been given a gift. The gift of understanding that my struggles don't disqualify me from this calling. They're actually part of what qualifies me for it. The transformation was beautiful to witness. Joe's final observations carried deep respect for what he had witnessed. You know what's remarkable about this whole conversation? You've managed to become more authentic in your faith by admitting your doubts, not despite them. Jonathan nodded, clearly amazed by his own journey. The honesty didn't weaken my faith. It strengthened it by making it more real, more grounded in actual experience rather than abstract beliefs. He smiled. I feel more connected to my calling now than I have since I started the show. That's incredible, Joe said with genuine admiration, and I think your portrayal of Jesus is going to be more powerful now because it's coming from a place of authentic wrestling rather than assumed perfection. Jonathan's anticipation for returning to work was evident. I'm actually excited to get back to set now, to bring this new understanding to the character. He paused. I think Jesus will be more human, more relatable, more inspiring, because he'll reflect someone who understands the struggle of faith, rather than someone who's beyond it. Joe smiled broadly as he prepared to conclude their time together. Jonathan, this has been extraordinary. You've given people permission to have honest faith, to wrestle with questions while still choosing love, to be human while pursuing the divine. Jonathan's expression showed both humility and gratitude. If that's what people take from this conversation, then every moment of vulnerability was worth it. His voice carried the conviction of someone who had discovered a profound truth about himself and his calling. I think that's exactly what they'll take from it, Joe assured him. And I think The Chosen is going to reach even more people now because they'll see it's being created by someone who understands their questions and struggles. Jonathan nodded, his transformation complete. That would be the ultimate honor, to create space for people to encounter love and hope, regardless of where they are on their journey of belief. The mission had evolved from performance to ministry, from acting to authentic service. As their conversation drew to a close, Joe offered his final reflection. You know what you've proven today? That the most powerful faith isn't the faith that never questions, it's the faith that questions everything and still chooses love. Jonathan's response carried the wisdom of someone who had been fundamentally changed by honest self-examination. And maybe that's what Jesus was actually modeling, not perfect certainty, but perfect love in the face of uncertainty. The insight was profound and transformative. Joe's respect for Jonathan's journey was evident in his concluding words. This has been one of the most honest and meaningful conversations about faith I've ever been part of. Not because you had all the answers, but because you were willing to wrestle with the questions that matter most. Jonathan's gratitude was deep and genuine. Thank you for creating the space for this wrestling, Joe. I feel like I've been transformed by this conversation. The change in him was visible and profound. That's what happens when people are brave enough to be vulnerable about the things that matter most, Joe observed. You've shown that authenticity is more powerful than perfection. That honest struggling is more inspiring than claims of certainty. Jonathan nodded, his peace evident. I feel like I can go back to representing Jesus with integrity now, knowing that I don't have to be perfect to be authentic. The burden of false expectations had been lifted, replaced by the freedom of honest service. Joe's final question carried both curiosity and care. How are you feeling right now, compared to when we started this conversation? Jonathan's smile was radiant as he answered. I feel free from the pressure to be perfect, free to be honest about my journey, free to bring my whole self to this calling. He paused, then added with emotion, I feel like I finally understand what grace actually means. Not that God loves me because I'm perfect, but that God loves me while I'm still figuring things out. That's beautiful, Joe said with genuine warmth. And that understanding is going to make your portrayal of Jesus more powerful than it's ever been. Jonathan's excitement for the future was evident. I think you're right. The character will have more depth now because I'm bringing more of my real self to it, including the parts that question and struggle and doubt. He smiled. That's a Jesus people can actually relate to and aspire to follow. Joe looked directly at Jonathan with clear admiration. You've just redefined what it means to have faith in a way that's both intellectually honest and spiritually meaningful. That's no small accomplishment. Jonathan's humility was evident in his response. I couldn't have done it without someone willing to ask the hard questions and create space for honest answers. He paused. This conversation has been a form of therapy disguised as a podcast interview. The best conversations usually are, Joe replied with a laugh. When people are willing to go beyond surface level and wrestle with the things that really matter, that's when transformation happens. Jonathan nodded, clearly changed by the experience. I'm going to remember this conversation every time I step into the role of Jesus. It's given me permission to bring humanity to divinity, to show that struggles and questions are part of the sacred journey, not obstacles to it. Joe's satisfaction with their dialogue was complete. Jonathan, thank you for being so honest and vulnerable. What you've shared today is going to help countless people who are wrestling with similar questions about faith and doubt. Jonathan's hope for the impact was evident. If it helps people realize that they don't have to choose between intellectual honesty and spiritual meaning, that faith and questions can coexist, then every moment of vulnerability was worth it. The potential for helping others clearly motivated him. I have no doubt it will, Joe assured him. This conversation is going to resonate with anyone who's ever felt caught between belief and doubt, who's ever wondered if their questions disqualified them from faith. Jonathan's final reflection carried deep wisdom. Maybe the most important thing people can learn is that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about having the courage to keep asking the questions while still choosing love. The insight was both simple and profound. Joe's concluding words carried deep respect for the journey he had witnessed. Jonathan Roumie, everyone, an actor who's brave enough to admit he doesn't have all the answers, while still dedicating his life to asking the questions that matter most. Jonathan's gratitude was evident as he responded. Thank you, Joe. This has been one of the most meaningful conversations of my life. I feel like I understand both my faith and my calling better than I ever have. The transformation was complete and beautiful. Have you ever felt like you had to choose between honest questions and spiritual meaning? Have you wondered if your doubts disqualified you from faith? Jonathan Roumie's raw, vulnerable conversation with Joe Rogan reminds us that the most authentic faith isn't the faith that never questions. It's the faith that questions everything and still chooses love. His journey from shame about his doubts to understanding them as sacred shows us that wrestling with God might be the most honest form of worship. Like, subscribe, and share if you believe that faith and questions can coexist, that doubt can deepen rather than destroy belief, and that sometimes the most profound spiritual growth comes not from having all the answers, but from having the courage to live the questions while still choosing love over fear.